The Legend of Zelda, a franchise that began all the way back in 1986 that has now become one of the most beloved and critically acclaimed video game series of all time. Every great franchise has its own defining characteristics, and The Legend of Zelda is no exception. For The Legend of Zelda, these could be anything from the items that you receive to the bosses that you must defeat to the vast worlds that you explore. But perhaps the most defining trait of the Zelda franchise is the dungeons that you must conquer.
Nintendo has been churning out dungeons ever since the original Legend of Zelda, and they were extremely innovative for the time. With the release of Ocarina of Time in 1998, however, there was a massive change to the predefined 2D Zelda dungeon formula. All of a sudden, when you entered a room, you no longer saw everything the room contained immediately. This gave Nintendo the ability to create much more complex and grand dungeon designs, and with each ensuing 3D Zelda release, Nintendo has never failed to deliver some of the greatest and most creative dungeons in the series.
Hey guys, this is Andrew from NinSon Gaming.
And I'm Brandon from I Am Not a Fox Video Games.
Because both of us have fully completed and enjoyed all 5 of the 3D Zelda games, we have decided to join together and rank all 35 of the 3D Zelda dungeons. Some people may consider there to be 36 dungeons, but we decided to leave off the Forsaken Fortress from the Wind Waker, because it's visited multiple times, and we just feel it's a little hard to compare it to the other 35.
We each ranked all 35 of the dungeons on our own, and then we shared them with each other. The final rankings came from taking each dungeon from our personal lists and assigning them a point value based on where we had ranked them. So for example, my 35th place dungeon was worth 35 points, plus the point value based on where NinSon had ranked that dungeon. There were several ties after our initial list. These ties were debated and then settled based on those discussions. Also, please note that we are by no means trying to attack or criticize any dungeons. These are just our opinions of how they compared to one another. So without further ado...
Number 35.
Number 35 is Inside the Great Deku Tree. My biggest complaint is that there really isn't much to it. It's too short and it lacks multiple memorable puzzles. The part towards the end of the dungeon where you jump through the spiderweb is certainly a good puzzle, but it's not enough to make the dungeon by itself. It's hard to blame Nintendo for a vanilla dungeon here because it's the first 3D Zelda dungeon ever made, and they really need to take care to allow Zelda players to adjust to playing it with a new dimension. Not only this, but I find that first dungeons are usually lacking in comparison to later dungeons in general. But even when compared to other first dungeons, Inside the Great Deku Tree is just too vanilla for me. It's not bad, but it is what it is, which isn't particularly great.
Yeah, I definitely think that the key word here is vanilla, because it's important to remember that Inside the Great Deku Tree is not necessarily a bad dungeon. It just really lacks any personality to it. It's just not a particularly memorable dungeon. You just kind of go in, you complete each room, you find the boss, and that's that. And it's just not a dungeon that I look back at and say, that was a really good dungeon.
Number 34.
Number 34 is Inside Jabu Jabu's Belly. I think that Inside Jabu Jabu's Belly is a pretty sizable step up from Inside the Great Deku Tree. I just found certain aspects of this dungeon to be annoying. While I thought that the setting of the dungeon was definitely unique, as you were actually walking around inside a living thing, and the floors were moving at points, there were just some parts that rubbed me the wrong way. I found it frustrating that for most of the dungeon there was no way to harm the enemies around you, and the only way that you could was by using Princess Ruto as a weapon. I also found escorting Princess Ruto around to be very annoying, and it really took away from the experience having to babysit her for most of the dungeon. Also, please don't get me started on the mini-boss. A step up from the vanilla Inside the Great Deku Tree, but just not enough to be ranked any higher.
Yeah, I think out of all the kids' dungeons, this was definitely the one that made me think the most, but I agree with you. There's parts where it's really annoying. Ruto adds some interesting elements to it, but it's nowhere near as good as the parts in the Wind Waker with Medley. This is the dungeon that really started to step it up for the 3D dungeons, but there was just too much annoying stuff for it to be ranked any higher than this.
Number 33.
Number 33 is Woodfall Temple, which suffers from the first dungeon issues I talked about with Inside the Great Deku Tree. It's not as bad, and I think this dungeon definitely does a better job of creating its own identity. The swamp aspect of the dungeon was pretty cool, It had a few memorable puzzles such as pushing blocks around and shooting the torch from the spinning flower. I also thought this dungeon did a pretty good job of using the Deku Mask's abilities. There were definitely more puzzles this time around, even if it still doesn't quite compare with some of the other dungeons in the series. I would likely have a higher opinion of the dungeon, but the pitch black room where you have to light all the torches is downright obnoxious. When I tried to do this room, I kept getting swarmed by black bows. The torches kept going out, and this really annoyed me. It might not be fair to let my opinion be swayed by a single annoying room, but unfortunately this room was just annoying enough to do it. This time around, it is truly a good dungeon, but I would never call it great.
Yeah, I definitely think that Woodfall is the first dungeon on this list that I would call good. I think that it was made pretty well. It was just, once again, there wasn't really too much about it that was special. I didn't have the same issues with the lighting of the 3 torches. I got through that part pretty easily, but I can definitely understand why that would detract from your thoughts of the dungeon. I just didn't think that it was super creative. I thought it was very straightforward, and it just suffered from the same issue that a lot of the first dungeons in 3D Zelda games have.
Number 32.
Number 32 is Dodongo's Cavern. I actually really enjoyed this dungeon, especially considering it was one of the Child Link dungeons. While it still wasn't very complex, it just felt more fun than both inside the Great Deku Tree and inside Jabu Jabu's belly. There wasn't really anything too annoying about the dungeon. It introduced the Lizalfos, and it had the neat puzzle where you had to drop the bombs into the Dodongo skull to open up the path to the boss, which I think was a step up from the similar spiderweb puzzle from inside the Great Deku Tree. The dungeon didn't look super great, but it at least had a decent atmosphere, and it was by far my favorite of the Child Link dungeons.
Dodongo's Cavern was definitely my favorite one of the child dungeons, but I personally preferred the Woodfall Temple over this one. I'm not typically a big fan of fire dungeons, so I would disagree with you a little bit about the atmosphere being great. I just felt it lacked color, and I actually think it had a lot less puzzles than the Woodfall Temple did as well. But I get what you're saying about the dropping the bombs into the skull, because I thought that was a really cool puzzle. But other than that, and then placing the bomb next to the staircase, there really just weren't a whole lot of memorable puzzles. Like the Woodfall Temple, this is another good but not great dungeon, and I would definitely call it the best child dungeon.
Number 31.
Number 31 is Ganon's Castle. I promise it'll stop soon enough, but again my opinion was changed, unfortunately for the worse, due to annoying experiences in the dungeon. This dungeon is good, possibly great depending on who you ask, but not for me, and I'm the reason it's this low. I'm not typically a huge fan of rehash dungeons that combine all of the other dungeons into one. I just feel they typically lack their own identity. But anyways, the puzzles here are good. The dungeon did a pretty solid job of rehashing the concepts used in previous dungeons, even if that's not a practice I'm typically fond of. I really just feel my opinion is warped, because when I did this dungeon most recently, I got eaten by a like twice, and had to go back and get a new fire tunic twice. Then I found out I still needed to go get the fire arrows in order to complete the rest of the dungeon. But aside from that, climbing the stairs to Ganon's lair while listening to the organ slowly get louder is one of my favorite moments in Ocarina of Time. It's a great dungeon, despite how annoying I found it.
I'm very split on how I feel about this dungeon, because when I first completed it, at first at least, I really enjoyed it, but then I started to get to some of the parts that I really didn't like, and I really didn't like the Shadow Temple part of the dungeon, and I really didn't enjoy the fire part of the dungeon, so I'm pretty torn. I feel like half of the dungeon was really good, and then the other half was not so much. I just feel like the biggest reason why I had this dungeon so low was just because I didn't really have any reason to put it higher. It certainly wasn't bad, but compared to a lot of the other really strong dungeons in this series, it just wasn't anything too special.
Number 30.
Number 30 is the Earth Temple from Skyward Sword. By this point, I think we've definitely gotten into dungeons that are good. It is just more of the fact that some dungeon had to end up this low. I thought the Earth Temple did a lot of things very well. It looked really good, especially for a fire dungeon. It had a really nice dungeon theme, and I really enjoyed rolling around on the giant ball, as well as the Indiana Jones sequence right before the boss, where you had to run as fast as you could away from a giant boulder that was right behind you. The problem that I had with this dungeon is that it was just too simple and straightforward, especially for the second dungeon in the game. The dungeon itself was composed of only about 5 really big rooms, and because of that, it didn't feel so much like I was exploring the dungeon. It felt too much like, walk into this room, do the puzzle, walk into the next room, do that puzzle, until I finally got the boss key. Definitely a lot of strong features to this dungeon, but overall, just not a lot of overall substance to it.
I agree with you in the sense that it's definitely a very basic dungeon. When you talk about it only featuring 5 big rooms, I think that's actually one of the things that defines the dungeons in Skyward Sword, and I think it's what makes it really good. Because in some other dungeons, they can drag out at times. It's a lot of getting keys, and it really doesn't add a whole lot of substance. And I think the dungeons in Skyward Sword, to an extent, cut that out. The Earth Temple did that as well here, but the problem is that, like you said, it's too simple, and it doesn't quite feel complete, which is why I have it as my lowest rated dungeon in Skyward Sword. So I think it's a good dungeon. It's getting close to being great, but it's still not quite great yet because of the simplicity.
Number 29.
Number 29 is the Fire Temple. It was a huge step up from the child dungeons to the adult dungeons, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is my least favorite of the adult dungeons of Ocarina of Time. I've always felt that fire-themed dungeons feel a little dull as far as the aesthetic appearance goes. They always seem to be in caves and lava, and not a whole lot else. This dungeon is the best example of that. I'm sure it's getting old by now, but there were a few parts that were incredibly annoying, such as falling several floors back to the beginning while trying to reach the hammer. Overall, it still had several good puzzles, like the firewall room, finding and freeing the Gorons, which is ironic because the keys were in their jail cell, and especially using the hammer to drop the platform and gain access to the boss room. With all that in mind, the best thing about this dungeon is the sense of urgency, not typically seen in dungeons. Darunia going into the boss room made you want to go there quickly in order to stop him and the other Gorons from becoming dragon food. Going along with this, the presence of friendly NPCs not named Princess Ruto was also an interesting touch that helped the Fire Temple regain some ground on the other 4 adult dungeons.
I wouldn't say that the Fire Temple was by far the worst adult dungeon. I won't spoil anything for now, but let's just say that I had it above another adult dungeon. But I still think that it was one of the weaker adult dungeons. I definitely understand the atmosphere issue. It was pretty bland to look at. It was just looking at a lot of really dark colors that nothing really ever stood out. And there were definitely some puzzles that I found very annoying, like the puzzle where you had to hit a switch with your hammer just so you could run across the room on a narrow pathway and open the chest before it caught back on fire. And puzzles like this really did detract from it. But I still think that it was a pretty solid dungeon, and I do look forward to playing this dungeon again.
Number 28.
Number 28 is Dragon Roost Cavern. This was a pretty good dungeon, especially for being the first dungeon in the game. I really liked how instead of the entire dungeon taking place inside of the volcano, you also got to go outside, such as during the mini-boss fight. It was just a nice change of pace to see the bright blue sky at times, rather than constantly looking at various shades of red, yellow, and orange the whole time. I also really enjoyed the grappling hook, and how it was integrated into traveling around the dungeon. The biggest drawback for me was just the fact that when I was making my list, I couldn't really remember a lot of specific parts of the dungeon. I can't remember the dungeon theme, I can't remember any big or impressive puzzles, and other than the mini-boss battle and the boss fight, it just didn't leave much of an impression on me. I guess I just had positive memories of the dungeon, rather than having specific memories of the dungeon. A good dungeon that was really well made, but still not quite great.
I think the biggest thing that I enjoyed about this dungeon is that I felt it flowed really well. You have to go to multiple rooms multiple times, but it never really felt like backtracking. It's just that there are several different parts of the same room that can only be accessed as you progress later in the dungeon. You mentioned the dungeon theme, and I think the reason you can't remember it is that I felt it was really ambient. There wasn't much to it, it was almost just a subtle little bongo playing, and that was really it. Like you said, I definitely felt the dungeon did a great job of implementing the grappling hook as a method of getting around, but unfortunately, I thought the controls behind it weren't the best. Gently nudging the joystick a bunch of times in order to aim it really slowed down this dungeon for me. But overall, I felt allowing the player to go outside really helped this dungeon's atmosphere overcome my typical attitude towards fire dungeons. Even the lava inside this dungeon was pretty decent to look at. In general, this dungeon did really lack memorable puzzles, but I definitely still enjoyed it.
Number 27.
Number 27 is Skyview Temple. I had originally ranked this beneath the Earth Temple, but I actually grew to like it a lot more on my second playthrough, so much so that I would actually rank it higher than the Earth Temple now. True, it was just as basic as any other first dungeon, but like I said while I was talking about the Earth Temple, I really just feel the length issue in this dungeon is due to cutting out unnecessary time wasters. It was much less tedious than most dungeons, even if it ultimately ended up sacrificing length and a little bit of the epicness. The atmosphere in Skyview Temple is one of the best in any dungeons. The dungeon theme adds a nice sinister feeling to an otherwise beautiful dungeon. I loved how this dungeon deviated so much from the stereotypical forest dungeon to add a hint of water as well. I also really enjoyed the beetle. It's possibly my favorite item in any Zelda game I have played, and I love how the motion controls worked for it. I'm actually a fan of the motion controls in Skyward Sword, but I can see how using the beetle would detract from the experience for someone who isn't. But regardless of the controls, I thought the beetle added a lot of neat elements to the dungeon. I really enjoyed using the beetle to find a bunch of hidden rupees and triggers in the walls. The other highlight of the dungeon was the Guardian Eye puzzles, especially the last one with 3 eyes. It was short and it was sweet. It was still a first dungeon and it didn't quite overcome the flaws of the basic first dungeons found throughout the franchise, but I think this is the first dungeon on this list that I would call borderline great.
I still wouldn't call the Skyview Temple great, although I will concede that it is definitely one of the better first dungeons in the Zelda game. I really liked the look and feel of Skyview like you mentioned. I really appreciated a forest temple that wasn't so much, "Look at all the trees and spiders and plants!" but instead added the water to show off more of the nature side of the dungeon. I also absolutely loved the dungeon theme. It really made the dungeon feel more mysterious. The beetle was also definitely my favorite new item from Skyward Sword, and it was implemented well throughout the dungeon. But I still just can't get past the simplicity of the dungeon. There were really creative parts to the dungeon, but it was still just too short and narrow for my liking. I felt like I was only completing one part to move on to the next part, rather than exploring a huge dungeon. Make no mistake, this was a good dungeon, but I don't think we've reached the great ones yet.
Number 26.
Number 26 is Ganon's Tower. I personally thought that of all the rehashed final dungeons in the series, this one was the best. I felt that it did a really good job taking the atmosphere from the other dungeons and using them again, while still doing a good job of using fresh ideas, rather than copying and pasting the original dungeons. But maybe the real kicker for me was the fact that this dungeon only used rehashing as a starting point and then formed its own identity afterwards. I enjoyed the Phantom Ganon maze, where you had to fight him 4 or 5 times and enter the door that his sword pointed towards. I will admit that having to fight him so many times can be annoying to some, but I really didn't mind it. I also really liked the ascent to the top of the tower. Something about climbing your way up the wooden structure to face off with Ganondorf really resonated with me. It is still a rehashed dungeon, so I can understand why it isn't super high, but it's still a fun dungeon.
This isn't my favorite rehash dungeon, but it does still do many things well. I agree that the rehashing part is done fairly well, but in addition to the rehashing, this dungeon does at least have somewhat of its own identity. The best part of that is the last 2 rooms in the dungeon. Towards the end is one of the most epic looking rooms in any dungeon in the series. There's nothing to it other than climbing the stairs, but I think the massive staircase leading to the boss door is just so epic, even more so than the ones found in Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. But after entering the boss door, there's the mini-boss fight with Puppet Ganon. This is a fun fight, but I don't think it's fair to count that for this dungeon, as it's more of a boss fight than a part of the dungeon. But like you mentioned, I also enjoyed climbing to the top of the wooden structure in this room to reach the final boss. I will also add that this has one of my favorite dungeon themes in the series. For me, this dungeon was held back by the fact that it was a rehash dungeon. I'm not a huge fan of this concept. It's not a bad concept at all, but I typically think it's tough to put rehash dungeons above a dungeon with original ideas. But this one did actually end up above a few original dungeons for me. My biggest complaint is that the fights with Phantom Ganon are repetitive, and if you don't catch onto the whole follow his sword gimmick, then it can be really frustrating. This may be my 29th favorite dungeon in the franchise, but I still thought it was pretty good.